When 18-year-old Daniel Chrestensen rode his scooter to school on the morning of November 3, 2004, he had no idea that by afternoon he would be pulled out of class, thrown into his first real fire, and come terrifyingly close to never seeing another. Daniel was a high schooler at the time who also had part-time jobs as an apprentice carpenter and as a volunteer firefighter, two jobs that he loved, as they gave some sense of purpose to his beloved hometown called Kolding, a beautiful town located in southern Denmark. On the eastern part of this town, there's a quiet and peaceful neighborhood called Seest, and not far from the main road, there was one warehouse facility that didn't quite fit in, one that, by all accounts, shouldn't have been there, especially not after what had happened in Enschede, Netherlands just 4 years earlier. This warehouse facility belonged to Johnsen Fireworks, one of the largest importers and wholesalers of fireworks in Denmark. And by the early 2000s, they began importing large shipments mainly from China and some other countries to repackage them for retail. And in the weeks leading up to New Year's Eve, warehouses like this one were especially full to fulfill the potential end-of-the-year demands. On the Wednesday of November 3, 2004, employees were sorting fireworks into retail packaging and getting them ready for distribution. It was a routine process, one they had done many times before. But that afternoon, two seasonal workers who had only been on the job for a few days accidentally dropped one of the boxes from 40 centimeters high. The box contained consumer-grade rockets, and when it hit the floor, it got ignited instantly. The flames spread quickly through the nearby stacks, fed by packaging that was thin and easy to burn, especially when they were tightly packed. And just within a few minutes, fireworks started going off inside the building as smaller items began igniting one after another. Johnsen's fireworks factory was a place where quote-unquote safety was taken seriously, which meant all employees had been trained and knew what to do and where to evacuate if a fire broke out. So when they realized they couldn't handle the fire themselves, Jørgen Poulsen, as the logistics manager, ordered all the employees to evacuate and to gather at a meeting point located approximately 100 meters from the warehouses. And from there, he called the emergency. Fire crews arrived on scene roughly around 6 minutes later at 1:33 p.m. Among the first responders was Daniel Chrestensen, who was assigned to the outer perimeter where his team was setting up hoses to cool the building's exterior. His team included a man named Max Jørgensen, a 33-year-old veteran firefighter with more than a decade of experience in the department. And according to Daniel, Max was calm under pressure and always focused on understanding what they were dealing with. So he stepped closer, just enough to try and assess the fire's path through the structure. But at that point, no one realized how unstable or dangerous the stockpile really was. The situation worsened since the building didn't have sufficient water containment system, and the tanker that was supposed to supply them with water had not yet arrived. Realizing this potential danger, emergency services decided to evacuate all residents within a radius of approximately 400 to 500 meters of the warehouse for safety reasons. This single decision eventually saved so many lives because at exactly 2:34 p.m., the building exploded. The blast was powerful enough to shatter windows more than half a kilometer away. A fireball rose above the rooftops and smoke darkened the afternoon sky. The explosion was heard over 20 kilometers away, and the shockwave generated ground tremors strong enough to register a magnitude of 2.2 on seismographs located as far as 125 kilometers away. Due to the immense pressure, the warehouse manager was thrown to the ground by the wave. He survived, but Max Jørgensen stood too close and was killed instantly. There's no photo of him from that day or any other day that we can find on the internet, but the helmet he wore that day became a symbol of his commitment to keeping the people of Kolding safe. The blast also threw Daniel backwards with a lot of force. He survived, with injuries that severed his face and made him unrecognizable. And he survived only because he hadn't stepped forward when Max did. That single moment became the line between life and death. and as he was receiving first aid from his colleague on site, he saw his other colleagues came dragging the body of Max Jørgensen, the only fatality of this disaster. Roughly 10 minutes after the first explosion, another container located next to the first one exploded. That was when the incident commander named Bent Emil Sørensen made the decision to pull everyone out of the zone as the site had become too unstable and more explosions were expected as fire was spreading between containers. Max had to be left in the inferno for the safety of the rest of the crew. Sørensen later stated in an interview, "At that point in life when you make a decision, it's the right one. If you know it's the wrong decision, you don't make it. I still think it was the right decision to pull us out of the area, and I still think that with the risk that came after the first two explosions, it was also the right decision to leave Max in there." He stood by the decision, but it haunted him for years. He described sitting at home with his family and suddenly breaking down as the thoughts would come out of nowhere, wondering what they could have done differently, wondering why they didn't, wondering all the questions that will never have a definite answer. And over the next 6 hours, the rest of the site ignited. Shipping containers detonated one after another. By the end of the day, 75 houses had been completely destroyed, and over 350 buildings were damaged. All of this nightmare happened in a residential neighborhood, in a place where families lived close by from a fireworks depot. There was no law requiring any physical separation between homes and sites like this. The facility had also been inspected. Its licenses were also valid, and by every official measure, it was considered 100% safe and legally compliant. Although Denmark had seen minor fireworks fires and storage mishaps before this, but none of those ever reached the scale we saw in Seest. And it happened just 4 years after a similar disaster in the Netherlands, one that should have served as a lesson and a warning. But no one acted on it, and nothing had been changed. Investigators from the Danish Emergency Management Agency, or DEMA for short, together with police forensic teams, quickly began a full-scale investigations after the disaster had been contained. One of the first goals was to confirm how the fire started. Based on physical evidence and testimony from warehouse staff, investigators believed that the likely cause was a box of fireworks dropped by seasonal workers from 40 centimeters high. The warehouse layout made everything worse because Hall 2 had no internal fire compartments. It was a single large open space that was filled with stacks of cardboard boxes and wooden pallets. So once fire ignited a section, it had a clear path to the rest as there were no barriers to slow it down. The building was also constructed to meet legal standards for Class 1.4 fireworks, which under Danish law were not considered capable of mass explosion. This assumption determined everything, including the layout, the licensing, the way storage was organized, and the absence of any suppression or containment systems. But that assumption turned out to be wrong. Because investigators found that although the company was licensed to store only Class 1.4 fireworks, much of the stock hadn't been properly classified. Some items arrived with vague or incomplete paperwork. Some had labels written in Mandarin that were never translated or verified, and at the time, there was no standardized legal requirement to retest imported fireworks, so the company accepted them as is, and often repackaged them without further checks. Sounds familiar? It sure is, because after analyzing fragments from the explosions, investigators concluded that some of the products stored inside Hall 2 should have been classified as Class 1.3 or above, and a few others displayed characteristics more typical of 1.1 explosives. These are categories for fireworks capable of full explosion, Not just low-level fire, as would be expected if the items had truly been Class 1.4. And when the flames reached those stacks, that's exactly how they reacted. And it was even more dangerous because all around the warehouse, there were dozens of shipping containers packed with extra fireworks. They'd been added over time as the company brought in more stock. And some were stacked right next to the building with barely any space between them. So when Hall 2 went up in flames, the fire quickly spread into the containers outside. These containers were made of standard steel and were not designed to handle internal combustion. Once heat and pressure built up inside, each one effectively turned into a confined bomb. Investigators later described it as a textbook domino effect, with containers exploding one after another, which amplified the force and spread burning debris in every direction. According to DEMA's final report, the facility was holding 282 tons of fireworks, including approximately 39 tons of net explosive material at the time of the fire. If that stock had been correctly classified, far stricter zoning laws and safety standards would have applied, and the layout of the site would have been designed very differently. The investigation from Enschede Disaster 4 years earlier exposed how weak the zoning laws were, and how fireworks across Europe were being stored in ways that didn't match the real risks. The Dutch government responded immediately to make sure that this kind of disaster would never happen again, so they rewrote the regulations and enforced strict limits on how and where fireworks could be stored. But between 2000 and 2004, Danish fireworks law stayed untouched. They didn't make any adjustments to zoning rules, nor implement requirement to test or verify the hazard class of imported fireworks. Labels were also still accepted at face value, even when they were incomplete, or written in a foreign language. And while other countries moved to limit how close fireworks stockpiles could be to homes, Denmark kept its existing guidelines. Facilities like NP Johnsen were still allowed to store tons of fireworks just meters from residential streets, as long as the paperwork said Class 1.4. The result was predictable, and it came exactly what it was expected to. But despite the scale of the disaster and the clear evidence of regulatory and safety failures, no one was ever prosecuted. Neither the company owners nor the two workers responsible for dropping the boxes faced any criminal charges. The Danish police and DEMA concluded that while serious mistakes had been made, the facility had valid licenses and followed existing rules on paper. And because of this, the legal threshold for criminal negligence was never even met. But pressure from both the public and the media eventually pushed Denmark to confront the regulatory gaps that allowed the explosion to happen. Officials acknowledged that classification alone wasn't enough to determine risk, and that too much authority had been left to importers when it came to labeling, storage, and internal safety procedures. It wasn't until 2005 that the first meaningful changes were introduced, when the Danish Working Environment Authority released updated technical guidelines for fireworks storage. These guidelines introduced recommendations for increased safety distances between fireworks storage and residences. They also required that companies document more clearly the types of fireworks being handled, including the net explosive mass, and not just their hazard classifications. Operators were now also expected to submit full safety documentation before receiving site approval. That included internal fire response plans, spacing diagrams, warehouse design, and descriptions of how they would handle misclassified or high-risk stock. And in some areas, local fire departments began conducting more frequent inspections. DEMA also issued recommendations that fireworks storage should be physically compartmentalized, though this was not made a strict national requirement. And although these new rules are positives, critics remain the same, that Denmark basically waited its own disaster to happen before changes were made. Around 2,100 people were evacuated that day, and most of them had no idea if their homes would still be there when they returned. The city of Kolding quickly set up shelters in public buildings, and volunteers from across the country began distributing meals, mattresses, blankets, and anything to help the victims. The Red Cross played a big role with logistics in coordination with Kolding municipality and local emergency services, and for the first 24 hours, no one knew how long people would be displaced. The fire was still too unstable to allow inspectors in, and structural engineers couldn't begin assessments until it was fully out. It would take 6 days before the first residents were allowed to return, and even then, only to collect their belongings. Some houses were damaged beyond repair, while others had taken on so much structural stress that it wasn't clear if they could be salvaged at all. The final damage report listed more than 350 buildings affected. 75 of them were completely destroyed. But the structural damage wasn't the only thing people had to deal with. Because years after the disaster, the Knowledge Center for Psychotraumatology at University of Southern Denmark studied the psychological impact on Seest residents, including children, adults, workers, and also emergency responders. A follow-up screening conducted in 2008 found that 15% of the children continued to show signs of PTSD, even 4 years after the disaster. These were the children who had witnessed massive explosions, and then forced to evacuate, and then realized that their homes were destroyed. This kind of experiences eventually left some long-lasting effects such as trouble sleeping, anxiety, fear of loud noises, and fear of being away from home. The trauma of hearing the sound of fireworks are real for some of these victims. And among adults, the rate of PTSD was up to 9 times higher compared to the neighboring districts. In response to this, special weekly trauma recovery programs were offered year-round by the municipality to those who showed signs of PTSD or subclinical PTSD. And for Max Jørgensen, he was honored in a formal memorial held by the Kolding Fire Department, and his name was added to a permanent plaque. His colleagues remembered him as someone brave who took the work seriously and didn't need recognition for it. He was a veteran on the team, and he was only 33. May the world never forget his sacrifice, and may his soul rest in peace.